Okay, so this is Professor Cummings, and this is the second part in the series of student debt and understanding debt. Like I said, there's a $1.7 trillion student debt crisis. There is a huge amount of consumer debt in the U.S. And one of the things I wanted to make sure is that people understand, particularly students who are dealing with a lot of student loans, what's going on with their student loans and how it actually can be hurtful to them and hurt their future, as well as how to handle it, how to better understand it before you go into debt, and not to be scared of debt, not to see debt as some force that you have to avoid, or, but it can actually be used wisely. So what we're going to do is just go to some very basic concepts here. So again, if this seems like this, I'm talking to you in really overly simplistic concepts. I'm doing this because a lot of people really don't understand debt very well, and it has caused them a lot of problems. So some of the things I'm going to go through is answering these three questions that I posed at the end of the last video, which is, what is debt? Also, how does debt help? Meaning, what's the purpose of it? And, is it actually serve anything other than enriching, say, the banks? And how does debt actually hurt? So obviously, if we're calling it a student debt bubble, a debt crisis, obviously there's a downside to it. So let's understand what it is and how we get there. So let's go through, kind of run through a basic example here. So imagine you're trying to do any number of high value activities. One, you could be buying a house, you could be going to college or sending somebody else to college, one of your kids, or you're just purchasing a car. Unless you have money around to pay for this, to pay for these items outright, which most people don't, what you need is to find a way to get that money. And in some places where they don't have the concept of debt or a formal debt system, I should say the concept of debt in certain countries, you can't buy a house, for example, with a mortgage. You actually have to pay for the house piecemeal. You have to accumulate the money and buy it portion by portion by portion. That's the way it is in certain parts of the Caribbean and, in a few other countries around the world. So the whole idea of paying for big ticket items is something that is actually very daunting without debt. Again, houses can be, hundreds of thousands of dollars. College can be, tens of thousands of dollars, maybe going up into the hundreds of thousands, depending on how long you're in college. And, cars could be, again, tens of thousands of dollars. So, if a person doesn't have the money, to make a purchase, they can actually borrow that money, usually from a bank or some other institution, in the present with the promise to repay that money in the future. That is a very basic definition of debt. You're actually borrowing money today to pay back in the future, but that's, a very simplistic definition. But, how does debt actually help? It allows you to make purchases or leverage the future income into the present. So it allows you to leverage what you might make and what you can potentially make, for things that you can do today. So again, one of the reasons people in the United States can buy a house outright, buy a house, is because you have the whole concept of debt and a system that allows you to go into debt to buy it, versus other countries where you basically have to make major purchases in cash. Or even, there was a time in this country where people actually did things like purchase cars and other items in cash, and when they did use debt, which was not nearly as much as we do today, it was paid off fairly rapidly. So what is debt? Debt is an agreement between the borrower and the lender, usually a bank or some other lending institution. So again, keep this in mind. Think of it as an agreement. You're actually saying, here's what I'm going to do, because that's going to become important as we go through this presentation. So here's a couple of definitions of debt. And again, like I said, I was going to give you my sources. So this is, there will be a source from this is an actual source, not my word. So there's two definitions from the Oxford English Dictionary. Again, that's my source that I'm using here. You can go to check this out online. If you type in what is debt, and the first definition is, that which is owed or due. an obligation. Anything has money, goods, or services which one person is under obligation to pay or render to another. So again, debt is an obligation. It's money, goods, or services. It could be a promise. It could be, a good deed. People think of themselves as indebted. Second definition, a liability or an obligation. Again, an obligation to pay or render something. So render something. The condition of being under such an obligation. So if you're under an obligation, you're indebted. You have a debt. So again, notice the consistency in the definitions of what debt is. This is an obligation that you owe something to someone else. So again, debt, it gives a longer definition. I got this from a legal document. Debt is when something, usually money, is owed to one party, the borrower or debtor, one of the same, to a second party, the lender, or sometimes called the creditor. Debt is deferred payment or series of payments. Again, you're talking about the future, that is owed in the future, which is what differentiates it from immediate purchase. So again, that goes back to, the example of buying a house or going to college. You can't pay for it immediately, so you go into debt to pay for it, and you pay for it over a series of payments. Second paragraph, the debt may be owed by a sovereign state or country, local government, company, or an individual. Okay, commercial debt is generally subjected to contractual terms regarding the amount and the timing of repayments of principal and interest. Now, pay attention to the red. Now we're getting closer to the whole concept of debt and how it is that I want you to start thinking about it. That whole last sentence, commercial debt is generally subjected to contractual terms. That should have been in red, regarding the amount and the timing of payment of principal and interest. So again, I want you to look at that. Just got a few concepts that I want you to grab onto, and then I'm going to bring it home, I think the next slide. So loans, bonds, notes, and mortgages are just all types of debt. And that's something I think most people know. So if you're going to borrow money, basically you're going to have a contractual agreement with some sort of terms, and it's going to have something to do with the amount that you're paying, how you're going to repay it, the principal and the interest. So when you go into debt, these are the four things that come into play. The interest rate that you're paying, the interest that you're paying, the timing, the general terms, and the principal. So I'm going to go through and look at each one of these, look at these different components of what a debt is, and show you, we finally get to that last question. So what is meant by the terms of a debt? So again, another definition, the general and special arrangements, provisions, requirements, rules, specifications, and standards that form an integral part of an agreement or contract. So this could, in terms of your terms and agreement, it's the length of the loan. So, you go in, you take out a debt, and they say you'd have to pay it back in 6 months, 5 years, 60 months auto loan, 30-year mortgage, 15-year mortgage. So the length of the loan rate, and the type. Again, so the loan rate is just your interest rate, how much they're calculating onto that debt over certain periods of time, as well as the type. And we're going to go through two general types. There's multiple types, but there's two general types of simple and compound interest. Then fees, these other things are really big deals in terms of how people kind of stumble around in debt and cause themselves problems. So fees such as late fees, fees that you step outside of grace periods. The grace period is, a certain amount of time before the other fees kick in. Fees for insufficient payment, so just different things, different penalties, stipulations on how you're going to pay. And that's important because that can turn into increasing your principal. And then amortization, which is just the way that the loan is actually spread out over time, which, can have a big impact on both how it's paid, in terms of how much money you're actually paying and how long you're obligated to that debt. So now let's look at one of the most important parts of the debt component. Again, all of them are important, and you're going to see this when we start looking at some of the calculations. But this one is the interest. This is the one that gets most people's attention. So what is interest? It's the money paid for the use, the money paid for the use of money lent, which is the money lent is the principal, or for forbearance of a debt according to a fixed ratio. So that's the rate percent. So again, it's just, somebody's loaning you money, usually a bank, it could be a relative, it could be, some individual payday lender. In the short term, they are losing the use of that money. So how do they compensate themselves? How do they make this worth their while? They charge you something called interest. And when they charge you that interest, that's you actually making a payment so that money is actually, so they're actually, basically it's worth for them to lend it to you. If they loan it to you with no interest, with 0% interest, they've essentially handed you money and they've lost the use for it for as long as you have it until you finally pay it back. So interest is, what actually comes in to help pay for that money that you're borrowing. It also will reflect how much risk that the lender is actually taking on. So a person with a low credit score will be charged a higher interest rate because they're a higher risk. Person with a longer term loan, going out longer number of years, will be charged a higher interest rate. So when you look at car commercials and you look at a loan that's going out to say, now you can see 84-month loans versus say a 60-month loan. The interest rate is always slightly higher when you start going out because the bank or the lending institution is taking on more risk. So interest is the cost of borrowing money, where the borrower pays a fee, to the lender for using the latter's money. The interest typically expressed as a percentage. And that's why your interest rate, is said in 4%, 7%. Can either be simple or compounded. So that's what I meant by the types of interest. There are two basic types, simple and compounded. So let's look at more into what that is. So what is the difference between simple interest and compound interest? Well, the names are really telling, really tell you everything you need to know, or almost anything you need to know as far as conceptually, but not a lot of detail. So simple interest. So simple interest, just like the name implies, is calculated very simply. The interest is calculated and it's paid off. It never gets reabsorbed into the loan or what's known as capitalized. Capitalized just simply means it's reabsorbed and becomes part of the principal as it grows. The equation is actually, again, very, very simple. The simple interest, if you borrow a certain amount of money, you just multiply that amount you borrowed times the interest rate and times the number of times that loan is going to be recalculated. So if you are calculating something on an annual basis or a monthly basis or even a daily basis, what you're doing is you're looking at that and you're actually calculating that N is the number of how often that's going to take place. Now, as far as compound interest, this one, the interest is capitalized. So it's actually reabsorbed into the principal. You don't pay off all the principal in each payment, and it actually gets reabsorbed into the principal and it continues to grow to the next time it's paid. So it takes longer to pay off. So it's a bit more of a complicated process. So interest is calculated in every period and is only partially paid. And look at this formula for compound interest. So you can see it's the principal is P, I, that should be an R, for interest. N is the number of times interest is applied. So it's the period. And then T is the number of times, so the number of periods that this is going to take place. And one thing I want you to pay attention to here, you look at the time, N and T in this case, and N in simple interest. One difference is it is exponential in compound interest. So this is going to be an exponential growth for a compound interest. So if we were to map this out, this curve would be linear. You're just multiplying it times itself, or times each one of the terms with each other. And then this one is actually going exponentially. So it will be an actual, exponential curve. So it'll grow very, very rapidly. So let's look at an example. So we have both of these equations. let's say we're going to borrow a certain amount of money, say $500,000. So getting an initial loan of simple interest versus compound interest. If you look at the simple interest and we look at set some terms, okay, we want to do it for 3 years and we want to do it at a 5% interest rate, compounded annually. At the end of those 3 years, you would have paid $75,000 in interest, on $500,000. That's 5% over those 3 years. All right. So now look at compound interest. And again, remember, it's going up exponentially. Here, the formula actually is corrected. So it is an R instead of an I. So this compound interest. So again, you got a $500,000 initial loan. So that is your principal. You're still looking at it over 3 years. And we now have 5% interest, and it's compounded annually. So every year we're recalculating the interest, and we're doing that for 3 years. If you work through the formula, I'm going to put the whole formula down here, but that comes out at $78,812. So in 50 cents. So as you can see, compound interest grows a lot faster than your simple interest. So over the same period, you've paid $3,000 more. Now, imagine if we did this over 10 years. Imagine if we did this over 30 years as a mortgage. How much more you would actually have to pay with compound interest versus a simple interest. So again, it's really important when you take out a loan to know how this interest is being calculated, how it's being accrued. If you're taking out a loan with simple interest, as most car loans are simple interest. A lot of your loans are indeed simple interest. Even your mortgage is actually simple interest, believe it or not. You can actually end up paying significantly less on that loan versus, say, a compound interest. All right, compound interest is so powerful that Einstein actually made this quote. This is a pretty famous quote by Albert Einstein. It says, "Compound interest is the eighth wonder of the world. He who understands it earns it. He who pays it or who doesn't pays it." All right. And again, so you can just imagine, if you are paying compound interest on a debt versus simple interest, or in other examples would be mutual funds. If you were to buy a mutual fund, you would actually be earning compound interest, and if you're reinvesting the dividends. So, you put a certain amount of money into your 401k, into an index fund, and you're making a certain amount of interest off of it, and you keep reinvesting it. You're essentially doing compound interest, and that's how people actually retire as millionaires, if they actually do put in routine payments into an investment, and they do it from the a time when they're really young, and they keep time on their side. Now, there's something else that's called amortization. I mentioned that in the terms. So amortization, what is that? That is two definitions. Again, two definitions most commonly used for a gradual write-down of the cost of intangible assets that have a specific useful life. Second definition, probably the one that sounds makes a little more sense. The action or process of reducing or paying off a debt with regular payments. So what is it? It is the whole idea of spreading your payments over a certain amount of time. So, oftentimes a loan will be simple interest. Interest is calculated up front, but it actually is spread out over a certain amount of the loan, certain life of that loan, so that you are paying only so much off at a time. Not usually done totally even, not done totally even through, the same amount every year. But it is just a way your loan is actually being spread out. And you can go to different sites and see amortization tables and understand how your mortgage, how other types of loans are being paid off. Again, this is very important for you to understand this because, it can actually greatly affect how quickly you can pay off that debt. And it can actually, in some ways, make the debt, more or less manageable. So again, we'll get to the final question here. So how does debt actually hurt people? So we said how debt can actually help you. It actually allows you to leverage your future earnings to buy things that you couldn't otherwise purchase. You know, you can buy a house now because of debt. You can buy a car now because of debt. However, you are going to be paying interest. And the longer you take to repay the debt, the more you're going to pay, as we saw from both equations, whether it was simple or compound interest. And you also need to understand the terms of that. So how does it actually hurt you, though? It can potentially grow more than you expected it. You know, again, it can actually grow, again, how compound interest, if you're not prepared for it, if you don't understand what you're doing. It does divert resources to an obligation instead of your current or future concerns. So once you've gone through college, once you've paid for that or bought that house, you know, now you are obligated to continue paying, and you can't do other things. There's something, you know, where you actually may need to come up. You've actually got to put money towards that debt. You're servicing a debt now for the length of the debt. Robs your ability to accrue wealth. Again, that's opportunity cost. You know, it kind of goes back with the first point or the second point, which is once you've gotten that money, you know, or once you have to pay that money, you can't invest it, right? So you're paying interest, so you can't earn interest someplace else. You can't buy that mutual fund, or not as much as you would have if you didn't have a house note or a student loan payment or a car note. You know, so what can you do? Now that's in red. You can understand the terms and conditions of your loan. If you understand what your interest rate is, and you know the implications of that interest rate, you understand the length of that loan and all of the conditions that go with that loan, what the late fees are, what the grace period is on that loan, as well as how it's going to be amortized. You know, those things can actually help you out as far as paying the loan and accelerating your payments and getting out of debt a lot sooner. You know, so there are ways that people, you know, missing a payment, you know, that goes back into your principal, and it actually increases and extends the loan. You know, not knowing what your grace period, again, same thing. You know, so understanding those issues, or those items, those concerns, can help you out as far as dealing with debt and keeping debt from actually working against you. And this is Professor Cummings. We're going to have another video, and I want to get a second video out later this week. And I'll go through more as far as, you know, how to handle debt and how debt affects you. And I'll go into more specific issues with student loan debts in the next video. So particularly like federal loans, and, you know, what the difference is between the different types of loans that you might find yourself in. So again, this is Professor Cummings. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for the next video.